think so much of like queer people and like women, there's this idea that our body is like utilitarian, that we like exist to please someone sexually, or that we exist to just get pregnant, or that we exist to like do labor for this system that doesn't give us a lot back in return. And so that when you're seeking help for something that's like innate to who you are, like in exploring your sexuality, exploring your sex life, that doesn't feel natural. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to like normalize a big part of that.
Welcome to the Queerest podcast, your cosmic guide to the queer universe. Hosted by Andraé BVR, each episode takes you on an interstellar journey through queer culture, identity, and influence. From dismantling media tropes to exploring queer representation, we invite you to challenge norms and expand your horizons. So buckle up and set your phasers to fabulous. Close encounters of the queerest kind await.
Greetings, cosmic queers and allies. I am your host, Andraé BVR, and today we are diving into the revolutionary world of queer-affirming care. I'm so excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Varuna Srinivasan, a physician, public health expert, and a true trailblazer in reimagining healthcare for underserved communities. Dr. Srinivasan is a proud Johns Hopkins alum and a leader in reproductive health. They've created Planned Parenthood's first ever Asian American abortion toolkit, bridging critical gaps in education. Recognized by Serena Williams as a woman of courage, Dr. Srinivasan is now the CEO of Fluid Health, where they are transforming care for chronic pelvic pain with compassionate, specialized therapy. Beyond their clinical work, Dr. Srinivasan is an accomplished writer. Their work has been featured in Cosmopolitan and Vogue India. They've been a sex columnist for Allure and part of Parents Magazine's review board. Their advocacy for LGBTQ rights and reproductive health has earned them countless accolades. Based in New York City with their husband and dog, Dr. Srinivasan blends their Buddhist roots with a passion for social justice. As a physician turned entrepreneur, they're redefining healthcare for women and sexual minorities everywhere. Dr. Srinivasan, welcome to the Queerest podcast. We are so thrilled to have you.
Thank you for having me. I know that I wrote that intro, but every time I hear it, I'm like, yes, I'm kind of a bad bitch. But yeah.
Absolutely. I was saying this to my husband yesterday. I was just like amazing accomplishments. Like the impact is global. Like you are killing it. And it's like so inspiring. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited, and congratulations on the launch of your podcast. This is really incredible. The production value is out of this world. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to get things kicked off as far as our interview is concerned, your career spans medicine, education, writing, advocacy.
Yeah.
What has inspired you to focus on sexual health and queer visibility?
You know, I think I work under the umbrella of healthcare, which is something that I've always been passionate about. And when I was in India, you go into med school quite early. And so I feel like I've been preparing to be a physician since I was like 13. Actually, when I was like really young, my dad asked me what I wanted to do. And I was like, I want to be a doctor. And then when I was a doctor, I was like, this is a lot. I want to work more so in public health. I didn't want to leave healthcare as a whole. And I think that a lot of the interest that I have in working in sexual healthcare is because I think that this is such a deeply politicized. I think we can see that especially now with the current administration. There is a lot more legislation. There's a lot more conversation that goes on around what people can do with their bodies. Bodies are highly political. You know, your gender, your sexuality is highly like influenced. It influences so many parts of our lives. But I think something that most people don't realize is how much our sexuality and our gender influences the health that, our health that we have and healthcare that we access. And so a big part of, I think, my work in sexual health and queer visibility is just rooted in one thing. It's how does gender affect health? And how can we make sure that people who are marginalized as a result of their gender or the sexuality or how they identify, how can they access care and how can they lead better lives? Because the system as we know it right now is essentially only built for cis het white men. Like a lot of the studies that we have, everything is extrapolated. When we think about like women's healthcare, everything kind of just comes down to, oh, we just need you to like get pregnant and give a baby. Nothing is kind of holistic or built around making them healthier or giving them richer lives. And so I think a lot of my work is kind of rooted in diversifying healthcare and making sure that it's not just for one particular part of the population. Healthcare should be for everyone. And I think sexual health kind of like embodies that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think like the lack of investment on research for women's and sexual minorities health is so it's abysmal, honestly, really, because it's like there's so much research that's not done to understand the human body and how much that's harming, the wider, community for not that lack of investment. You know what I mean? So absolutely. So want to take a quick step back and kind of talk about kind of your identity, as a bisexual, non-binary individual in a heterosexual marriage. How do you navigate the perceptions of your identity, both within the queer community and in broader society? Because I think that's such an interesting topic that is very nuanced.
Yeah, this is kind of like a double-edged sword. And I think my identity is what led me to a lot of the work I'm doing today, is when I was reading so much about being bisexual. So I grew up in a conservative part of India, and being queer was not the norm. Like, I did not know a single queer person. I'll be so honest. Like, I had only met a couple of trans people, but they were also like growing up in Chennai, which is, in southern India. It wasn't like mainstream, right? And so I knew that I was like queer and I knew that I was bisexual, but the norm there is that there's like a compulsory heterosexuality or like a compulsory like heteronormativity. And so much of what we see in the TV and with my parents was like, don't date boys. And I was like, okay, you don't have to worry about that, because I was like making out with girls, at parties, but then in the open, I was kind of like dating boys. And it was this idea that I was like preparing to be someone's wife. And so that part of me was always hidden until I moved to the States. And then when I went to Hopkins and I saw all of these like out and proud queer people, I was like, this is a thing. You can be out and proud and you can be queer like this. And that's amazing. And so I was like really drawn to it. And I remember, so that at that point I had already started dating my now husband. While I was dating him, I was kind of coming to terms with the fact that I am bisexual. And I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with, right? Because I think women especially are so like compulsory heterosexuality affects us the most, where it's this idea. If anyone has read like the Lesbian Master Doc, I really highly encourage, you don't have to be a lesbian or questioning to read it. I think it has such a great breakdown of compulsory like heteronormativity, in where it encourages women to exclusively look at men as the only sexual and romantic interest, right? And so you grow up in a lot of societies don't encourage women especially to explore their sexuality. They're kind of like already prepping them to be someone's wife, someone's mother. And this idea of sexuality isn't kind of encouraged for you to think about. And so at that time when I was with my husband, I was like, damn, okay, so I am bisexual, but I felt so guilty about it. But I was like, I'm kind of like, I'm supposed to be like this straight wife. I'm, supposed to be X, Y, and Z, and I'm supposed to get pregnant and be this like really hetero woman. But it wasn't for me. And I was going through a lot of like, I was going through like a really deep depression and a really deep anxiety. And I could see that I was like losing weight. It was really taking a toll on my relationship. And so when I was talking to a lot of my queer friends at that time, I think one thing that I noticed is how much happier they felt just kind of like living their truth and like being open about it. And they said that you're like carrying this grief and this guilt, like almost like you feel guilty about it.
Right.
And coming also from an academic background, I tend to intellectualize things. And so my coping strategy was to read a lot about bisexuality and be like, okay, I'm going to like inform myself, because I know that this feeling is there, but maybe I need to back it up with some data and I need to read about it. So I kind of did that. And the deep dive that I did had kind of shown me that 80% of people who are bisexual are in like heterosexual presenting marriages. So there are 50% of the community of the LGBT community, which like we are a large number of, this is talking about people who are out, not people who are closeted. But
Right.
50% of us are bisexual. In
Yeah.
fact, more trans people are bisexual. And so I was like, okay, wow. So we're out there. Like, so why aren't we like talking about this? Like, but we're all kind of like ashamed about it. And I was also reading studies that show that bisexual women are also like less likely to come out and kind of struggle in this like gray area because they also face higher rates of like domestic violence and interpersonal violence. And so I think that learning about this like interesting space that I'm in, where it's like, yes, I have proximity to privilege because I can like apply for a house, like, I can apply for a mortgage. And, I was just reading yesterday that Thailand just legalized same-sex marriage. Like I didn't have that problem, right? Like I can go to a courthouse tomorrow and celebrate my love openly. I can hold my partner's hand. Like there's kind of like, we live in this like heterosexual society. And so like, I get a lot of those privileges. But it's also like, there's a lot of stigma that I still have to face. Like it often feels like if I'm not my biggest advocate, I'm not my biggest ally, and then people are just like, okay, girl, like you don't know what it means to be queer. And I disagree with that because I think that a lot of about being queer isn't who you're having sex with and like who you're like kind of like openly dating. I think it's more like, I think it's like in the life that you live, right? It's about like chosen family. It's about community. It's about giving back. It's about, understanding that sexuality is so much more than it is, yes, partnership and it is sex, but it's also so much more than that. So I think it's like, it's just so nuanced and there's just so many thoughts and feelings about my identity. And I'm constantly talking about it in therapy. But I think that the fluidity, I think has been really incredible for me to embrace because it really does show that sexuality is a spectrum, right?
So would love to kind of double click into the, bisexuality of it all. There are a lot of persistent myths around bisexuality. And I'm curious, like, what is your approach to dismantling these biphobic myths? Just because there's a lot of negative connotations associated with the bisexual community. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
A big part of the work that I do on social media is education. And I think like visibility, people are like, why are you like constantly talking about it? It's always attention seeking. But I've had so many, especially, being brown and being from this really conservative culture, there are still so many brown people that are in my DMs that are like, wow, you have actually like, just seeing you has helped me kind of like break down some of the internalized myths that I have about being bisexual. Because again, it is one of those things that's mainstream. I think, in Western cultures, it's definitely very mainstream. And there's a lot more acceptance, I think, about like being queer, like Miley Cyrus is like pansexual. Megan Fox is bisexual. Halsey is bisexual. And so we're having a lot more like visibility in that sense. But I think like for a lot of other countries, this idea of visibility really matters, right? Because that also like helps break down a lot of the myths. And I think I'm also in a position where I have a bit of thick skin. And so when people are like, oh, you're having threesomes or you're like cheating on your husband and you're just doing this for attention, I'm like, yes, okay. And like this is literally my,
first of all,
like that's what social media is for. Social media is literally like, you're doing this for attention. Yes. So that I can get someone's attention and I can influence their thinking. That is literally what this app is all about. So I don't know what you are telling me that I should be doing differently. And I think like I want to challenge notions about bisexuality. I think another big part of what I try to educate people on through like also breaking myths and saying, no, we are not greedy. No, we are not promiscuous, because narratives like that are incredibly harmful and they bleed into society, like with healthcare providers thinking that, having to question or ask invasive questions, like they're not really trained on how to ask questions about the sexual history. And so they end up making people feel worse than they are and triggering parts of their identity. And already bisexual people face this, we are less likely to come out and we're kind of like grappling with, should I, shouldn't I? Which is a really, really, if anyone has ever been in the closet, you know how horrible that feeling is. Nobody can relate to that. Yeah. And so then you're like avoiding healthcare, which affects your health. And bisexual women especially are less likely to get tested less likely to get pap smears. And as a result, are more likely to get cervical cancer. And so, I think it's like part of the education is also saying that this is who we are. Like instead of just breaking down the myths, it's also showing that your myths and the ways in which you all are perpetuating biphobia and bi erasure has a direct effect on our health, has a direct effect on our mental health, like higher rates of like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, substance use. I mean, the data is there. So
Yeah,
I think that's also part of it, is not just saying stop, like don't bully a bisexual person. It's more like your actions actually have direct consequences on our livelihood. It has direct consequences on who we are as people. And it's also educating the bisexual community as well. I think one thing that I want to make very clear that I also was grappling with in the beginning is this idea of like heterosexual privilege or like passing privilege doesn't exist. And I think like
right.
also for the bisexual community, it's educating them like, yes, you are bisexual, but I also want you to think about like social positioning, right? I want you to think about privilege and oppression. Like we're in this really unique place where, especially if you're in a heterosexual marriage, like you are equal parts privileged and equal parts oppressed. And so like, how do you
Yeah,
navigate that? Because it's so complex. And the myth is, I think there are still a lot of myths around that, yes, we can take up space, but it also means that, there are other people within the community that need more help, that need more support, especially
right.
like trans people. And it's not to say that we don't belong in the community. It just means that within the community itself, like we're more in a point of privilege. So I think there's myth busting on both sides, because I,
Yeah,
I think that's
absolutely.
a big part. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I think like the fact that like they make up the largest block of the LGBTQ plus community, and yet they're the ones that are getting a lot of erasure. I
Yeah,
think like that's really unfortunate. Like a lot of the focus, goes on to lesbian and gay individuals, and I think trans people face erasure as well. I think
yeah,
those are the two kind of communities within that umbrella that really are facing that, and I think it's harmful for their own existence, but I think it's harmful like on a wider scale of like not understanding that our society is made up of all these different individuals, and
correct.
that impacts different public accommodations, whether it's healthcare or safety or housing or what have you. So there's a
Yeah,
lot to that.
yeah.
So would love to talk a little bit about actually fluid health, my fluid health. What led you to create this organization? And I would love to know, how does it support individuals experiencing chronic pelvic and sexual pain?
Yeah. So my goal was always to create better access to care. And that's always what I was interested in. Drawing from my healthcare background and from going to public health school, I think I'm really interested in systems level thinking and changing the system, because I think individual action is great. And I think there are a lot of providers that are doing the work. Like my partner is a doctor, and he does a lot of work in like addiction and working one-to-one with patients. And at the same time, a lot of the work that we want to do is systems level thinking, because if you don't change how we access care and how we can improve like the healthcare experience for different populations, then we're never going to get to where we need to get to. And so I think that was kind of the at the root of the work that I'm doing. And we had strategically chosen chronic pelvic pain because I noticed two things. So a big part of building, so we have an app right now that connects people, women and sexual minorities who have chronic pelvic pain or any type of pelvic pain or sexual pain with sex therapists. So you can book a 15-minute consult call, which is free with the therapist. And then we also help you prep for it, and we give you the emotional support that you need. And we had built this after I had like interviewed over 200 people. Like I did put out surveys, and I had a lot of conversations with people. And overwhelmingly, when I was talking to women, especially queer women, I found that a lot of them don't feel heard or seen by their providers, which we know is a big issue. A lot of queer people are afraid to access care. But I also think like women, especially, really there's a lot of stigma in having to like talk about not just your sexuality, but talk about the intimate details of your like sex life. I found that when you go to the OBGYN and you're kind of just like, I just had the surgery, or XYZ happened and I'm not able to have sex, they're kind of just like, oh yeah, have a glass of wine before bed. Or, figure it out. And then as a columnist for Allure, I had written this article on like vaginismus, which is this condition where the vagina contracts or spasms every time you try to have penetrative sex. And a lot of people live with vaginismus. And so I was doing this article, and I usually put out a call for action, like call for like people to talk to me so I could report their stories. And I had like, I think 100 responses of people being like, yeah, I have it and I have no one to talk to. Would you tell my story? And I was like, okay, there is something here. Like I'm seeing this like really stigmatized condition that people are experiencing. And I'm also seeing that, they're also having a hard time kind of like accessing care about it. And so when we first initially thought, okay, let's do sexual dysfunction, which is, right now there's a lot of products in the market for penis owners. They have erectile dysfunction pills that you can get from like Hims and Hers, or you can like go to the doctor, and there's Viagra, and there's more studies done in men and people who have penises. Even though the percentage of women and queer people that have sexual dysfunction are much higher, there are less options in the market right now for them to deal with sexual dysfunction. And then within that, we did more market research, and we found that pain, especially like chronic pelvic pain, disproportionately affects lesbian and bisexual women more than it affects heterosexual women. So we were like, okay, so like women are like struggling with pain. They can't really talk about it because, as we've seen, pain is an incredibly gendered experience. It's this idea that queer people are used to pain, or like women are used to pain. So this is just another thing that they have to deal with. They can go up to 7 years without getting a diagnosis. So they're just living 7 years without a diagnosis, taking pills, kind of bouncing around doctors, not really knowing what to do. And so then we thought, okay, so if we're connecting them with care, we know that the experience that they have going through like accessing care is hard because no one believes them. No one takes their identity into account. No one is sort of like giving them the support that they need to figure things out. And I think for like queer people and women, like our relationship to health is dependent on our relationship to other people. So a lot of the times we avoid care because we're like, there's no one to take care of my child, or I don't have access to insurance. Again, because you're queer or you're a person of color, and that's just how the system is built. And so there are all of these like barriers. So that's one of the things that we wanted to do, was like also give support for like, so social support essentially, like, where are you right now? Are you able to access care right now? How can we make things easier for you? And we chose sex therapy because, again, I think the mind-body connection is really strong for women and queer people. And it's more a supplement. And that's something that's often overlooked, like the psychological and the emotional support. And also, you deserve to have great sex. Like, I'm so sorry.
That should be, yes.
If you think that women are not having sex and you're constantly shaming us for having sex, no, we want to have sex. It's not, people think like, oh, we want to have sex because we're promiscuous. No, I want to have a relationship. I want to have intimacy with my partner. Like that's one way that I want to express love. But that's kind of not, again, like socially acceptable, right? So when you're seeking care to have sex, or you're seeking care to like want to be able to enjoy it, you feel bad. You're like, why do I feel like such a fiend? Like this shouldn't happen. I think that's also part of what we're trying to normalize, is like, no, like, a lot of them come to the sex therapist only when their partners start getting, like when there's like a fight between them and their partners where, oh, you're not having sex with me. And I think so much of our body, and I could talk about this for hours, as you can tell, but I think it's like, our bodies, I think so much of like queer people and like women, there's this idea that our body is like utilitarian, that we like exist to please someone sexually, or that we exist to just get pregnant, or that we exist to like do labor for this system that doesn't give us a lot back in return. And so that when you're seeking help for something that's like innate to who you are, like in exploring your sexuality, exploring your sex life, that doesn't feel natural. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to like normalize a big part of that. So we have our pilot right now. We're very excited. I think like in a couple of months, we're going to launch it a little bit more wider so we can have more people using our app.
That's amazing. Congratulations on that. That's such a huge, I think it's the work and research you did in order to bring this to life, I think is so impressive. And like your passion to, scale this wider, I think is so important, because I think this is, as you saw in your DMs, like this is an issue that is very common and it's stigmatized and it's not talked about enough. And so it's like, to have you be such a trailblazer in that space, I think is so important for so many people. So I think that's fantastic. I would love to, and I would love to hear kind of like, has there been kind of a moment in the process that you've been, working within fluid health that has really reaffirmed, like a specific moment that's really reaffirmed the importance of your mission and how you're carrying it out and what you're trying to accomplish?
I will say that right now, this is something I always think about actually. So all of the people working with me right now are Black and brown queer women. Like, we are queer and trans people, like all of us. And I think that to me is like, because I would always think, I think I had this, like someone tell me, they were like, oh yeah, if you ever want to raise money for your startup, you need to have a man, or you need to have like a white man with you, because that's just who they give money to. And it's right. I think that's right, because like Flow, which is like a period app, which is like just raised, I think Series B or Series C, hundreds of millions of dollars, is run by two white guys. Two white guys are running a period app. And then if you also look at most of the sex toy brands, or you look at most of the like women's health like apps, they are run by men, straight men. So that to me is just like, it pisses me off when people say that. And I feel that pressure sometimes, I'll be honest. And, there are a lot of solutions out there, but I can tell that the people who are working with me, right now we are in a phase where, again, I think, early startup life, there's you're sort of like, you're just trying to like show proof of concept, and you're trying to show that your product works. So you're not really like bringing money in. In fact, it'll take like maybe a year or two before you like break even, and then you start making a profit. That's just how business works.
Exactly.
And sometimes I wonder, I'm like, oh, why are they like doing a lot of this like pro bono? Like, why are they like here week after week? Engineers like helping me, why are my advisors meeting with me and connecting me with so many people? It's because they want to see that, because they know, like, and I was like, okay, it's making sense now. It's because Black and brown queer women struggle to access care, and they see a need for this. And so they are obviously the people that are here willing to do the labor and give their time and their effort towards building this. And I think that's what it is, right? I think that's affirming for me. It's like, we're building it for ourselves. And right now, like, we get the feedback, we're getting feedback. I mean, the road hasn't always been easy. We're still learning a lot. And I think a big part of learning is failing and like making mistakes. But I think like on the bright side, we can see the promise. And like a lot of people are like, oh my God, I'm really excited. Like, it feels like I'm talking to a friend, and women and queer people really want care to be informal. And so that's what we're trying to do, is really trying to bring this intimacy to healthcare. I think, this communalism to healthcare. And so when we're seeing positive feedback about that, I feel affirmed. So yeah, I feel it's like, I think that part has been really affirming for us.
That's fantastic. Yeah, because I think like a lot of, and I'll speak to my experience of healthcare, but like it's so clinical, and there's like that lack of connection, I think, in the human side of it, because I think like a lot of people maybe in the medical professional, like they do a lot of work with different people, and I think over time it maybe desensitizes them, so that it's they lose, I think, sometimes that like human element that I think is so important for people who experience a lot of just different things outside of like the general population that they serve. But it's like that's, I think it's an important part. I love that that's something that Fluid Health is doing to, connect people with compassionate care. I think that's essential, truly. So, as someone who is, starting an organization, a startup of this sort, I think imposter syndrome naturally becomes a part of the equation. There's a lot of things that you're learning in the process of building this that kind of can pervade the, overall like experience of starting something up that's brand new, that you have taken from paper to reality. Can you kind of unpack a little bit like what your experience has been around that?
Yeah. I'm not gonna lie, it has been incredibly stressful. And I think that's again because I was looking again because I love data and I love numbers.
Me too.
Good. I'm glad, because I feel like that's what I went to school for. Like I love, I think that again, I think data can be flawed sometimes, but I use it to inform a lot of my work and my understanding of the world. And I'm a scientist. Like, I feel like, I went to med school, I went to public health school, and I feel like a lot of it, I wanted to be like science-based, but like 1% of the funding, less than 1% went to like queer founders, as a whole. And even within that, like even less goes to like, Black and brown folks, less goes towards trans folks. So it's a lot of like, again, like, cis gay men, like white gay men, and I think that that's also like, that's one of the things that I find really stressful is, again, this idea of like who I should be to get to where I need to go, when who I'm building for, like, this work is still important. And also I think, from what we've also seen in this election, like there's so much of like identity politics, in the sense of like, I think that there's this idea that, women again aren't like leaders, or we aren't meant to do business, or like this is something that doesn't come naturally to us. And also the idea that they're like, it's not even the idea. I think I face so much of pressure to do things right all the time. Every time I mess up or I fuck up, I actually feel so nervous, because I think the general public, as we've seen, is just so much harsher like on women than they are on men. Like we can very evidently tell by like our president, and like, the idea that even though he had so many court cases, he's a convicted felon, rapist, that's fine, he can still be president. That will not, we don't exist in a world where that reality is possible for like a woman, let alone someone who is queer or someone who is like a person of color. You know what I mean? So I think I feel a lot of that pressure to like do things right, because I often feel like I'm subject to a lot more scrutiny, and there's again like just an overall pressure. So I think that that's definitely, I think, the other side of the entrepreneurship struggle that, is just something that I'm learning to deal with. But I think this is the thing. I was talking to one of my engineers yesterday, and she was just like, you if you have a secret sauce and you're building it for the people and they want it to exist, it will exist regardless of how things go. And we're also in the age of Aquarius. You know what I mean? Like we just have to do things differently now. It's just not going to work like the cis white way anymore. Like it's just not. Like I think that we're starting to realize that, and I think we're like there's an impending revolution happening. So that's giving me like, spiritually and like in an astrological sense, it's giving me a lot of like courage. But the stress and the imposter syndrome, and for a long time I just didn't feel like I belonged in certain rooms. JP Morgan invited me for a dinner the other day, took us to a Broadway show, and I was like, what am I doing here? Everyone is so much more accomplished and is so much further in their business than I am. And I think like a big part of that is like, no, you deserve to be here. Like they wouldn't have invited you if you didn't deserve to be here. And you absolutely deserve to be here. But it's like, I think so much of it is like, also I'm changing so much as I build this business. And I think like building that, like, yes, you belong. Yes, you're doing it. Yes, it matters. I think that that's also been incredibly healing.
100%. And I also think that a lot of the criticism of just female leaders, female business owners is steeped in misogyny. That is what it is. And it's like, they've built this system in a way that discourages women from being able to do this. And that's the problem, is that the fact that you've internalized this messaging that, even minor mistakes are bigger things than they actually are, is really, I think, how the system is meant to work, unfortunately. And it's like, you are doing, amazing, impactful work that is changing people's lives. And, the fact that you are not a cisgender male, like doesn't, preclude you from the fact that like you are just as like driven, just as passionate, are doing things that are just as big of a scale. And I think that shouldn't stop you, because it's like the impact of what you're doing is so wide reaching. And I think it can only grow, help more people that need to be helped.
Thank you. Oh my God. Yes. And it's again, like one of my friends is like, she's like, you just need to think like a finance bro. You just need
there you go. Yeah.
And I was like, if a finance bro can do it, I can do it. So
exactly. 100%. That's the whole thing at the end of the day. It's like, you are fully capable of doing anything that anybody else can. Anybody that tells you otherwise is trying to prevent you from doing it. That's just plain and simple. You know what I mean?
Honestly,
So I want to talk about your TED Talk, because I watched it and it is so cool. It's TED Talk, first of all, like obsessed. I want to talk about like you emphasize like unlearning societal norms around sexuality and health. And I want to know like how can people begin in this process in their own lives of like unlearning a lot of like misinformation or untruths or half-truths around sexuality and health?
It's so interesting because I think that again, it's like it works at different layers. and it's your personal conversation, and it's like your community. It happens at a personal level, community level, and interpersonal level, and then it also happens at like a systemic or a societal level. And so much of it kind of depends. And so in your conversations, I think we also like grow up in this like binary, like where we're like male female, like this is what it is. And I think that one thing I encourage people to do is kind of like push themselves to think outside of that, because we are so uncomfortable thinking about that, because we have to know we're struggling to feel comfortable in this like area where we don't really know what the answer is. And I think that's where a lot of like the intolerance comes from. I think it comes from fear. The hatred comes from fear. A lot of the violence comes from fear. We're not comfortable as a society kind of like embracing that. But again, I think that's one of the reasons why so many people are like pushing for sex education, or like inclusive sex education in schools. It's not that we're trying to teach your kid how to have sex. Like we're teaching, it's harm reduction. And we're not teaching that to like fourth graders. We're obviously teaching that to like high schoolers, so that they can feel prepared and be more like, again, it's harm reduction, right? We're trying to prepare them in the eventuality that they decide to have sex, to have safer sex. But for like younger kids, I think it's so much about sex education is teaching them that what is a good touch, what's a bad touch. Like people are different, and sometimes they look different, and that's okay. It doesn't mean anything.
Right.
And I think so much of like intolerance and like homophobia and transphobia is learned, right? We are teaching it in the house. We are teaching that to our kids. We are perpetuating that. It's this idea that if they exist, I can't exist. But that's because you were never given that space growing up, right? And so much of it is like when I was young, I remember I reflect on this so much, where my dad would not let me wear pants. He only wanted me to wear dresses.
Mm-hmm.
And like he never had that space to kind of like unlearn what it meant. Like is it that she's allowed to express herself the way that she wants to, and that's okay, and that's safe. And there are just like so many, unfortunately, again, we're like moving into this direction, I guess. Even in America, we like to think that we're this like liberal democracy, but so much of it is like parents telling their kids that I'm going to kick you out if you're queer, or like I only want a boy, I don't want a girl. And we are still not in a place where we're like comfortable unlearning about like unlearning some of the harmful gender norms, right? And so that's what I talk about in my TED talk as well, is like, if we as a society are not willing to like have those uncomfortable conversations and to accept that there are things that exist outside of what we know right now, then we're never going to advance. And I think that's the fundamental issue.
Yeah. And for those who have not seen the TED Talk, make sure you watch it. It's fantastic. Highly recommend it. No, I loved it. It was fantastic. I want to talk now a little bit about combating gender-based violence, because I think this is a really important issue. And you've highlighted it, in the role of sex education, in reducing harm. What changes would you like to see in kind of global sex education practices that you think would help address the issues around gender-based violence?
First off, having sex education at every single level will reduce gender-based violence, because studies have actually shown, again, that it improves tolerance and that understanding of other genders, right? And so at baseline, if you just have inclusive sex education in all schools, that's great. I think the second thing is also, unfortunately, I think so much of the reading I do is around the gender binary and like internalized sexism. And, even thinking about various cultures, we have all of these practices that come as a result of like the patriarchy, right? As a result of like this idea that like men are superior to women, again, because we view women's bodies as utilitarian, right? I think one way that we are like perpetuating gender-based violence is because of that, right? It's because we think that like men are superior to women, and that even when you think about, especially I'll use sexuality as an example. I was watching a show yesterday, And I don't know if you've ever seen The Morning Show, but this is just an example,
Oh, yes, 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 yes.
yes, you have, like, okay. And I think for like in one episode, for like one of the male co-anchors' birthdays, they brought out like a cake and they brought out all of these women to dance. And they're like dancing, they're like wearing wigs and they're wearing like these, like this, basically like this onesie, kind of like the sexy onesie.
Right.
And I was just thinking, I was like, damn, okay, like when men want sex, it's something that's so accessible, right? It's this idea that their sexuality and their like need to have sex is there.
Right.
And so like that's their right. Like you can't, like, even when you think about sentences like you can't wear that, you can't, like, you're like teasing me, or you're like instigating me, or like I can't control my urges. But the same doesn't apply for like women, right? Like we don't have brothels for women to go to, or we don't have like shows that we can go to. We can't really like use our body in that way. And so like fundamentally, I think that gender-based violence also exists as this idea that like sexuality is inherent, or like sex is inherent to who men are, and like that's who they are. But when it comes to women, it's this idea that like sexuality and sex, when it comes to them, is evil and it's bad. And like if you look at a lot of like religion, even like with Eve eating the apple, like she ate the apple because she was lustful. Like she ate an apple, okay? Like just calm down. It's an apple. It's not a dildo, it's an apple. Like, like, but they were like, oh my God, she's responsible for the downfall of society and women must be controlled. And it's like, I also think there's so much in Hinduism, like, and even in Buddhism as well, where this idea that like men should know better than to hang around women. We have like demons and angels, and that women who are inherently lustful are responsible for the downfall of humanity. And so their sexuality must be controlled. And so I think a lot of gender-based violence is in this idea that women are inherently evil if they're exercising their sexuality. And so a lot of the gender-based violence is rooted in controlling that sexuality, in controlling who they are. Like even when it comes to sex workers, I don't understand. To me, it doesn't make sense how when men have an expectation that women should be sex workers, or that they have the right to sex or use their bodies for sex, that they get angry when they are sex workers. Or that women, when like people are on OnlyFans, it just doesn't make sense to me. Because I'm like, more than 90% of men watch porn.
Right.
Like the industry exists because of you, but then you're vilifying and you're angry with the women who are participating in the system. It just is, it's like not making sense. So I think a lot of it is, I think a lot of it is again tied to this notion that like women's sexuality has to be controlled, or it's deviant, that men inherently have access, or that they're the only people that can have access to sex and sexuality and their right to exercise that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think like it's that kind of the trope around like either they're the virgin or the deviant. And it's like, it's at the end of the day, it really centers around like control and maintaining this like patriarchal society and structure that benefits them, while ensuring that women continue to come in second to whatever the pursuit and goals of the male are, which I think is really, I mean, we've seen what that's done over the past hundreds of years, whatever. It's not a great thing, you know what I mean? And it's like that has to be dismantled over time, so that women get the women and other minorities are able to exist in a way that they're celebrated, they're not objectified, they're not put in unsafe situations, they're not vilified, like all of those things that are done because it's a matter of power, structure, and control. You know what I mean? And I think that's really unfortunate, because it hurts and harms a lot of people globally, and men are the ones that get to benefit the most from it.
100%. Yeah.
So would love to talk a little bit about intersectionality in healthcare. Given your medical background, how does that inform your approach to address unique health challenges faced by LGBTQ+ individuals, especially those that are at multiple intersections of marginalization?
My belief is that at baseline, healthcare should be built for them and then should expand out to everybody else. Because if you are able to serve the person who is already living at multiple marginalized identities, then you can serve anybody. Like, it's kind of when it comes to feminism as well. Like, when I worked at Planned Parenthood, like that's one of the things that they said is like, if you are able to build a world where that centers Black women, then everybody benefits. And I think that's so true, right? Like if you are able to build healthcare that benefits, again, like Black women, like queer Black women, or people who are disabled, who are already living at like multiple marginalized identities, then like everybody benefits, right? But the problem is that healthcare starts with the white able-bodied person, and it's again very prescriptive, and it's meant for only one type of person. And then from there they try to like open it up to different populations, and I personally don't think that works. I think it's an afterthought. I think it's something that's kind of like, oh yeah, we're also, I guess, thinking about you, but it's like, well, no, you're not, because like the ways in which we access healthcare are extremely different and highly politicized, and so much to do with like who we are as people. And most of healthcare doesn't exist that way currently. The system that we're in right now only seeks to traumatize people like over and over again. You know, I remember working at the Yale ED, and I was working with someone who had substance use issues, and they were enrolled in part of a study. And so I was going to give them like a gift card for like, right, just like filling out like a survey. And one of the doctors came to me and was like, oh yeah, how do you know that it's not going to use it on drugs again? And I was like, you know, at baseline, if we're already like existing from a place where like there is a norm and there is an abnormal, and you're like already looking at this person who's like not being the norm, you're further stigmatizing him and you're not actually helping him. Because okay, so what if he uses drugs? Like, do you, and that to me is just like blows my mind again, is that so much of healthcare is like just is literally that if you are not, like, why would they come back again and ask you for help if that's the kind of attitude that you have? But unfortunately, like even in big institutions like that, it still happens, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's why from the get-go, we need, to me, like, again, I think the other thing that I also feel like often at odds with is, I think calling it queer health is important. Women's health is important so that the right people know where to go. But I like to envision a world where, again, from the get-go, like the healthcare that we build is queer affirmative. And so right now, even with Fluid, our like target population are queer people, and we want them to come first, and we want to serve them first, and then we'll like open it up to everybody else. But that's our goal, is to like build this foundation that is already serving people who are brown and queer people of color, Black or queer people of color, and then also like spreading out to everybody else. Because, you know, I think that's what healthcare should be. But I think sometimes we have so many silos of like, this is only for women, or this is, you know, especially queer people do need their own healthcare. But I hope that we can live in a world where everything at baseline is already queer affirmative, is already culturally competent.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love to talk a little bit about body positivity and empowerment. And I think that's been central to the work that you've done. And I would love to know, how can queer communities foster healthier body image standards? Because I think, you know, there's a lot of types of bodies that are, you know, considered higher value than other value, you know, than other bodies. And you know, I think that's really harmful for a lot of people in general, because you know, there's people who are trying to attain certain body types that may be doing unhealthy behaviors, but would love to kind of hear how you would foster healthier body image standards in general for the wider community.
You know, I probably can't give that good of an answer here, because again, I live my life from someone who does have like a thin body. And so like, I don't face a lot of the stigma that different bodies face. I think that, you know, people who are intersex, you know, people who are plus sized can probably answer that question much better. But I think, again, from a healthcare point of view, I think so much, again, is stigmatizing, because again, bodies are politicized. And like so many of the people that I talk to, even from my Allure column, are constantly like, oh yeah, the doctor just tells me that if I lose weight, everything will be okay. I think that's why Ozempic is so like crazy popular, is because people think that getting thin is the answer. And I'm sure if that's your goal, is that you want to lose weight. And like, yes, I think like having a higher body mass or a body fat is, you know, can lead to a lot of like health issues like heart disease. But again, like, I think being thin doesn't necessarily mean you're healthy. I think that's one of the things that I've seen is like from the get-go, people look at me and they're like, oh my God, you're so healthy. And it's like, I live with 2 autoimmune diseases. and I'm like struggling to put on weight because of all the inflammation in my body. But
Right.
like I'm allowed to exist in society and not deal with that kind of stigma, but I'm kind of like dying on the inside. And I feel like even when I talk to my providers, I'm just like, they're like, you look healthy and you look fine. And I'm like, well, I'm not. And I'm really skinny and I'm losing weight. And I don't know where I come from. In India, people are curvy. I want to be curvy. I want to put on more weight. But that doesn't, I think that it's so interesting because again, so much of it is like based on like the ideal body, or like the ideal
Yeah.
body is healthy. And I think from a healthcare point of view, that's what I often see. And like dismissing women and telling them that they need to lose weight in order to be healthier, or, only treating conditions from a weight based point of view. Many doctors don't understand trans bodies. They don't understand intersex bodies. Um, Another thing that I was actually thinking about the other day was, when I was thinking about even lupus and the idea that I might have lupus, all of the pictures that I was seeing were rashes on like white people. And I kept thinking, what does a rash actually look like? Like the butterfly rash look like on brown skin? And I
Right.
couldn't really find it on like on an Indian person. And so I was like, damn, how will they know then? Like, have they been misdiagnosing me this entire time? And so even when I think about like body positivity, I think like the diversity of the human experience is really remarkable, right? And so I don't think medicine and healthcare has done enough to take that into consideration. So a lot of people are not getting the right healthcare that they need because they don't have the right bodies, or
Yeah.
that doctors haven't seen those conditions on their bodies. They've only seen it on one type of body. So I think that
Yep.
that's again like one of the conversations that I'm continuing to have is like also encouraging a lot of like healthcare to think about that. There's actually one page by this doctor. He started when he was a med student, and he actually started posting pictures of like what conditions look like on black skin, or like how
Mhm.
they show up, like how melanoma shows up on black skin. And I think
Right.
that type of education is really powerful, right? Or
Yeah.
like sometimes, when trans people like show their like top surgery, I think that's great because we need to see and we need to learn that. We need to like accept. And I think that's why I think visibility again is just so important. I think there are individuals doing this incredible advocacy. And I can find some of their pages and send it to you as well. And I think they do so much of incredible work. And I think looking, following their profile, I've read so much about like intersex bodies now, and like, they're developmentally diverse bodies as well. I think it's called developmental sexual, it's DSD. I don't know what the full form is. I have to look at it
Right.
again. But I think like that's another thing, right? Like there used to be so much of surgeries happening against their consent to again fit them in the binary, because healthcare is violent and we don't serve different bodies in that sense. I think now there's been a growing pressure on doctors to stop. They still aren't able to see their unethical ways, but I think like individuals are really pushing for change as well.
Awesome. Okay, so would love to talk about advocacy and the work you do around being a sex columnist for Allure, which is so cool, by the way. And obviously writing for other major platforms too. I'm curious, like, how do you balance like relatable content with advancing sexual health advocacy?
Yeah. Well, I have a great editor. Shout out to my editor, Kara. And she really, when I pitched the column to her, was really excited and has always gone with my formats and my vision, which whenever I write an article, I want it to be I wanted to involve like a level of advocacy and activism as well. So we're not just teaching you to have sex, but I think a big part of it is also like examining what are the cultural biases, what kind of like biases exist within the system, like who is marginalized. And I love that most of the voices that I include in my column are like brown women. A lot of Indian women reach out to me and they're like, I want to talk about sex. And we come from such a sex negative culture. Like it's crazy that all of them, when I read the stories, I'm like, yes, oh my God. Like, yes, we are having threesomes. Yes, we are going and to sex parties. Yes, we love BDSM. And I think that is so powerful again, because like going back to my earlier point is like this idea that sex and exercising sexuality only belongs to like one group of the population, when in fact like sex is so liberatory to so many other people, like this understanding of our bodies. And it isn't just like, oh, I'm having sex. It's so much about like, who am I? Like, what does this say about me? Like, I think a lot of what I include in the articles as well is like, what is the self? BDSM again is we talk about like consent culture in BDSM, but also the fact that like BDSM can be an incredibly like spiritual experience for a lot of people, because it
Right.
kind of challenges you to think about power and control in a really, really nuanced way, so that was one of the things I wrote about. When I wrote about the sex worker article, it wasn't just interviewing sex workers about the types of lipsticks and makeup that they use when they're having sex, so it doesn't melt, but it was also like talking about erotic labor, and again how we like as a society benefit off of these people, but then
Yep.
they have the least amount of access to basic human rights. So there are a lot of these agencies now that are giving legal support and housing support, and sex workers are considered a small business, but they don't
Yeah.
have a lot of the access to the small business like privileges that I would have access to or anyone else would have access to. But like part of that article was also writing about how like sex work actually boosts like, the economy. We don't want to talk
Yeah.
about. So I think like a big part of all of the articles I write about again is including that layer of um, this view on like society and culture as well, because I think so much of sex is tied to that. You can't write about sex without writing about society and culture and control.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like in general, like to be able to have sex, to be able to enjoy sex is liberation in some
It
capacity,
is.
about being able to, control your own self. And, in consenting relationships, obviously that's a dynamic kind of nuance there, but like
Yeah,
about really owning your identity and being able to be liberated to do as you want with full autonomy. And I think that's super
yeah.
powerful and empowering in general. So, and I love all the articles that you've written for it. It's been really fun reading and kind
Thank
of
you.
unpack all that stuff. I know, I think it's so great. I think it's like very essential learning, because it's like we don't get that type of sexual health education in schools or in
No,
colleges or
no.
even in media. Like media, oftentimes they perpetuate a lot of harmful stereotypes around sexuality,
Yeah,
minimize things, and do it a lot of times from the male gaze or from a
absolutely.
cis white het
Yeah,
point of view, right? And then that
exactly.
minimizes the experiences of queer communities and different diverse minorities.
Yeah, I was watching Sex and the City, and like so much of her column as well. I think when we think about a traditional sex column, it's about
Yeah,
like your sex experiences and the kind of sex that you're having. But let's just be really, really blunt and honest and say that, yeah, sex, like certain groups of people are allowed to have sex more than others and allowed to
right.
talk about it. But also, sex is an incredibly shameful experience for a lot of people.
Yeah,
Like a lot of people come from different cultural and religious backgrounds where sex is a sin. So many people haven't masturbated. There are still people who haven't had an orgasm,
yeah,
who feel really uncomfortable being open with their sexuality. About so many people are still in lavender marriages or in the closet. How are they having sex? So I think like it's also part of it, of the column, is like I do want to center that, and I think my editor and what Allure is also doing is like trying to break through that, and not make it like just like I'm not just talking about my own experiences. Like that's not what the sex column is about. It's about like
right.
how are we as a society having sex, and like
Yeah.
let's talk about that.
Yeah. And I think by being able to talk about these topics that are taboo when they really shouldn't be, I think it puts, like you said, it's a lot about putting shame on
Yeah,
sexuality and sex as a whole.
fact.
Again, kind of laddering into like the control part of it, the self-esteem issues around it. But it's like the more we talk about it, the more we normalize this conversation around sexual health and the
Correct.
diversity that can make up that, the better off our wider society and culture is, because then
Yeah,
that are considered taboo are actually not considered taboo, and they're able to be educated on all the different aspects around it. More
correct.
research can be done, more
Yeah,
information, because at the end of the day, information is power. And to be able to have more information allows people at the wider society to do more and be more safe and more secure in whatever they're doing.
exactly. It's so funny because when I just wrote this recent article on the orgasm, I just realized that I've been having vaginal orgasms for so long, but I didn't know that because went into a deep dive and I was like, damn, okay, that's a thing. I had no idea, like, and that I myself, who's writing about this, I was telling my husband yesterday, I was like, damn, oh my God, like, this is life changing. Like, I'm getting educated by my own column. So I think that that's also a big part of it, right? It's like pulling up this research, talking to different people, but we're like headed in a good direction. So that's good.
Yeah, agree. Awesome. And so the last question I think is really around like advice for advocates out there that are, seeing your work, appreciating your work, and wanting to understand how they can, impact sexual health and
Yeah.
LGBTQ advocacy widely. Like, what steps would you recommend to those people who are trying to advocate for more inclusive, sexual health, queer affirming care, that type of thing?
Walk the walk and talk the talk. Like, it's not just enough if you're just like, I'm an advocate. Like, you have to also like, you have to have uncomfortable conversations with the people around you. And, so much of it is like in my own marriage, like talking to my husband and like also reckoning with the fact that like I'm in this position of like privilege in like this passing relationship, and I'm this talking about bisexuality. And I think so much of it is doing that own personal work and thinking about that, and like, when is it my time to speak up versus when is it my time to just stand back and let others take up more space. So I think it's
Yeah.
so much of it is that, right? Like, I think so much of like activism is about like social media and showing up, and like it's this really like curated experience. And it's also like so much of it is sitting in that discomfort and having those conversations with yourself. And so I talk about that in therapy so much. I talk about like, am I, are the actions in my life mirroring the things that I talk about openly and that I write about? And so I think that's one a piece of advice I have. The second is choose your medium.
Yeah.
Some people have social media. I'm a writer. I use a lot of my writing to do my advocacy. Like, that's what I do. As I write, I want to make sure that my words reach the right people, and that has been really cathartic for me. I think writing is an incredibly cathartic experience. If you are a public speaker, do that. I don't really like posting a lot on social media. I feel like I used to do that a lot, and I have since kind of like moved on, because for me, social media didn't feel nourishing.
Right.
It felt more like an echo chamber, versus I felt like writing has been and reading has been so like incredible. So I read a lot of books. I'm reading All About Love by Bell Hooks right now. And
Oh, yes.
it's just so life changing. And I think that was one of my goals for 2025, is to like educate myself more and read more, and then also like write through my Allure column, and whatever I'm writing is like meaningful. And I don't take on projects where I'm not able to do that. So I would say like, choose your medium. And I think the third piece of advice I have is, activism can be really draining, and you can't, if you're like being inflammatory like consistently, and you're like always looking for conflict, and I think it's choose your battles, win the war. I think
Right.
that that's what it is. If there are some moments where you're like, my energy is not best spent here, and this is futile, it's not worth it. Versus like, what could you be doing that's more meaningful? Could you be participating in mutual aid? Could you be redistributing your wealth? Can you volunteer more? Is there like something else that you can do? Can you, just by being a good community member itself, I think is still powerful enough. So instead of sitting on social media and fighting in the comments, or
Yeah.
like, I think that if you want to do that, you can. But I found that for me, it was really draining. Like,
Right.
trying to teach someone from, I don't know, Ohio or Oklahoma, like, that's not where my energy is best spent. I think my energy was best spent like redistributing my wealth, or like thinking about like which groups I could participate in.
Yeah.
Healthcare is kind of like where I can do the most impact, because that's my background. So that's where I'm going to focus. And yes, I support all the other causes, but this is the one that I feel that I can do the most of, like, this is where my energy is best spent. So I think that's something that I've learned across my journey, because I used to feel like having like picking up fights with my dad or my mom would be like where I thought my activism was best served. Now
Right.
I've just learned that I can't change them. I can probably limit my interactions on like some of the things that they say, and I can send them resources.
Right.
But like also like, I think I can make more of an impact in other areas as well.
Yeah. No, that's great. And just because I want to make sure we address this before we go into our compulsory questions, what does the future look like for Fluid Health and your broader mission to create the future of queer affirming care? Which it's like a big question, obviously, but I think would love to hear like where you would like to envision this.
Yeah. Now, especially with the legislative changes, we've been thinking a lot about like access to care, because access to care is obviously going to be highly stigmatized and difficult. And so we are going to launch in a couple of weeks the app to a wider audience, because right now we're in the pilot, we're testing with a very small group of beta testers. And then once we release it, we kind of want to see what people are looking for. And then maybe grow into a bigger care coordinator platform where we can bring on more providers, like diverse providers. So like physical therapists and doulas and nurses, so that people can find the right providers that they need. And I think that a lot of it will involve a lot of work in like vetting them, but also I think that taking that keeping emotional support at the center of it. So growing it into this bigger like care navigation platform. It's possible. I think that we're also thinking about potentially turning it into a clinic. So I think that again, I want to build something that people need. And I think that that's where we're right now. We're in that phase where we're trying to also learn what people need, because the systems don't exist right now.
Right.
And we're actually building it. So I think for the next couple of months, as a true scientist, we will be in testing phase. And we'll be asking people like what they need and what they want healthcare to look like. And so based on that, we'll build it. But I think right now it's between a care navigation platform or a clinic.
Very cool. Awesome. So now I would like to ask you a few compulsory questions that I ask each of the guests that come on the Queerest podcast.
Yes.
The first one I have for you is, what is your go-to queer anthem that never fails to get you pumped?
This is, I know, basic B, but I love Born This Way by Lady Gaga. It really gets me pumped every time. Like, I'm obsessed with it. But also, is it Pink Pony Club by Chaperone?
Chaperone.
Yeah, I'm such a millennial. Oh my God. I love that song. I think it's so good. Oh my God. So that would be like a close contender. I think it's between those two.
Yeah, I love both those songs. Like with Pink Pony Club specifically, though, like I feel like it encapsulates like the queer experience in going to like a gay bar so well. Of like you're being yourself, you're stepping into your identity. Your parents are kind of like kind of wanted to stop you from doing that, to really embrace your full self, and you're like, no, this is who I am. Like, mama, I'm at Pink Pony Club and I'm gonna do what I would. You know what I mean?
Oh my God. It's the lyrics are so good. Yes.
Oh,
I think it's like not in your face, and those who are queer will probably understand it more, but it's amazing.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Next question is, if your identity came with a warning label, what would it say?
I thought about this a lot, and it's funny because everybody around me is like, oh my God, you are so temperamental. And I'm like, warning, I'm brutally honest, but it's coming from a place of love.
I love that.
No nonsense. Like, you're not going to come to me and I'm not going to stay silent when you say some shit to my face. I'm just going to be like, I'm going to snap and I'm going to bite, but it's coming from a place of love. Nothing comes from a place of love. Yeah.
I love that. That's fantastic. A bite with love. We love it. If you had a queer superpower, what would it be?
Okay, this is my queer superpower. Actually, this is more like if I were like the president, this is what I would do. I think at baseline, everybody should not be like straight. I think the default should be like pansexuality or bisexuality. And then you kind of evolve from there. And then you decide if you want to be straight or you want to be gay, or whether you want to remain bisexual or pansexual. But I think my queer superpower would literally give everybody this like space where they feel like they can express their sexuality and have that curiosity. And I think like that's what I hope for everyone. And sometimes I wish that I talk about this a lot, but I'm like, I just wish everybody were pansexual from the get-go. And then you get to decide what it looks like, instead of like straight being the default, because I don't think that's working for a lot of us.
I think you're right. I think it's like default heterosexuality, I think, is so limiting. And it's like, with that superpower, it would absolutely allow people to be able to explore like the spectrum of sexuality and understand that, like, I can like a little bit of this, I can like a little bit of that, and it's like it's all good. You know what I mean? Yeah,
exactly. And then I'm either like straight from there, or like I'm bisexual, or like whatever.
Exactly. Like if you want to choose your own adventure, you want to be straight at the end of the day after being pansexual, like by all means.
Yeah,
but, like,
exactly.
Opening, you know what I mean? Yeah, I love that. That's a great one. That's a really good one. What is your favorite piece of queer content? And that could be, film, show, book, music, whatever you feel like is something that you really are loving right now.
I love when again, we like to like say, oh, this book is like straight, or it's not queer, or it's queer. But like, I love books that kind of explore that as part of the general human experience, because I think that's what it is that we need to normalize sexuality as part of the human experience and not make it a binary again. And so I don't know if you've read Breast and Eggs by
I've heard of
Miyako.
it. I haven't read it yet.
Huh?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it yet though.
So the main character Natsuko is like trying to have a baby. Like she wants to like have a baby, but she's asexual. But she doesn't come out and say like I'm asexual. She has these really deep, like the way the author has written the character is that she's reflecting on like not having this relationship with sex, but like wanting to be a mother. But then like so much of the society again is so like rooted in sex. And so I think that that is my favorite piece of queer content, is how she explores sex and sexuality and the fact that this person is asexual. And like I think such a wonderful representation of like ace of people, like the ace experience. And like also like exploring real things like motherhood and relationships, which I don't think we talk about so much. We're often just like reducing ace people to like, you don't have sex, what is that like? But it's like, no, that she's like this really diverse individual. And I think that's my favorite book.
That's fantastic. I didn't know. I didn't like. I think the fact that like, asexual individuals are not
Yeah.
widely represented, I think is such a problem
No.
because like, yes, they may make up a small percentage of the out population
Yeah.
of ace individuals, but like that experience is still an experience that needs to be understood. And
Yeah.
I think that helps with better understanding our wider society, is that when we understand these, sexual minorities, we're able to better support everybody at the end of the day. So I think that's
So
fantastic.
she like leads with her experience and like what she's going through in life. And then it also brings up that she is ace instead of like going from the fact that she is ace, which I also think is really powerful. Like even like Breast and Eggs is like it's about like, reproduction, motherhood, and so many other things. And so I like that she has brought on, and this is like a Japanese woman in Japan. And then
Wow.
it's like it's so nuanced, and it's like, oh, this other like part of her that she's also discovering, like her sexuality, versus like reducing everything just down to her sexuality, which is something that
Yeah.
I feel with myself as well, is like, oh, I am this person and I'm also bisexual. And I often feel like people come to me through the lens of my bisexuality, and I'm like, I'm also this other person who also happens to be bisexual. So
Yeah, that's very common. I noticed, like in general media, it's like they limit us to like our sexuality or gender identity, and it's like we are full-fledged individuals, have likes,
literally.
desires, passions that we want to do
Exactly.
stuff that are not necessarily tied to our identity in that capacity.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it's also like, with I forget the Algerian boxer's name, but like even with them, where there was so much of like how they look, no one focused on the fact that she won and she's an
yeah,
Olympic boxer. It was
yeah,
so much on the fact of like, oh, she looks like a man and she could be
yeah.
trans. And I think this is a reality for so many queer people, is like we are just reduced to our identities. And it's like, yes, that is who I am, but I'm also all of these things. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And then the last question I have for you is, if you could give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be?
Your complexity is your strength. Every part of your identity, being queer, Indian, and an activist, I think makes you uniquely qualified to create the change that you want to see, and keep at it. There are a lot of times in your life where you're grappling for labels because it gives you a sense of security, but I think that sitting with that discomfort and sitting in that like fluidity is your superpower, because it doesn't mean that you're confused. It just means that you're creating space that didn't exist before.
Ooh, I love that. That was great. Love that. Thank you, Dr. Srinivasan, for this conversation. It was fantastic. You're brilliant. I'm so excited for Fluid Health and the
Yes.
future of that organization. Thank you so much for your insights and sharing your journey and your incredible work today. Your dedication to unlearning societal norms, advocating for visibility, and embracing intersectionality is not just inspiring, it's transformative. And for the wider audience that's listening, advocacy, visibility, and inclusivity are revolutionary tools for building a future where queer communities thrive. Dr. Srinivasan's story reminds us that self-discovery and authenticity are acts of resilience that can inspire change on both the personal and systemic levels. For listeners, please be sure to follow at My Fluid Health on social media. Dr. Srinivasan, are there any other places that they could find you, or Anything that they should know about any upcoming projects you have?
Well, just follow me on Instagram at DrVaruna Srinivasan or at Dr. Varuna Srinivasan. And yeah, keep a lookout for Fluid. If you know someone in your life that has pelvic pain or wants to see a sex therapist, please then send them to us. We'd love to have them use our app and give feedback and build with us. I think that's what we want to build with the community. So if that's you, reach out to us. And yes, thank you so much, Andraé, for having me on your podcast. So thoughtful, so insightful, and you've done such amazing research into my background, which is very, very kind. So thank you. I had such a great time chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for the listeners out there, until next time, please stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep expanding your horizons. Thank you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of the Queerest podcast. Thank you for joining us on this cosmic journey through the queer universe. If today's conversation resonated with you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your chosen family. Your voice helps grow the Queerest community. Until next time, stay curious.